as far we talked about before, you mentioned the secret sauce to PulseChain is some of the cross chain opportunities and stuff we got going on there. And it really reminded me about this question I had a while back about bridging and liquidity. What can you break down too? Because I'm trying to reason about. I don't think a lot of people, they hear that bridging is going to be great for PulseChain. It's going to back up the PRC20s. It's going to increase liquidity in pools. It's going to enable tokens to use maybe their platforms with cheaper fees, all kinds of things like that. But back up just on that point too. Backing up PRC20s. What does that actually mean? How do bridges? How is PulseChain going to do these types of things? Like how should we think about them?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess the way it'll work is, so you get your copy. So, so there's hex, and then there's the hex on PulseChain. So then when you want to move your hex from Ethereum over to PulseChain, your hex goes into the bridge, which then issues you another token on PulseChain that is, going to be called eHex, probably, hex from Ethereum. And then that eHex token on PulseChain is independent from the copy of hex that was made over there. So two separate assets. And then those two assets can trade against each other in PulseX. So, and that's why I think that like having the copies of the assets from the launch, and then also like encouraging people who are launching new things on PulseChain to also simultaneously launch the asset on Ethereum, is because of that, like having that speculative opportunity of trading the, like an asset, like a version of an equivalent asset on Ethereum and PulseChain. I think that can attract in a lot of bridged in liquidity to the PulseChain network. Just because, liquidity goes where there's opportunity, and that type of speculative opportunity of like, how is the market going to price hex on Pulse versus hex on ETH? Like, because there's a lot of uncertainty in that, like that uncertainty is the opportunity. And so the opportunity can bring in liquidity as people try to seize that opportunity. So I think that
could you go into the opportunity just for people who are just like, can you describe why would anyone would want to bridge in other liquidity into PulseChain with their tokens? Like how do they actually benefit doing that?
Yeah. So say that like the price of Pulse on hex measured in, or P hex versus E hex, say it's like, 0.4, it's not 1-to-1, it's like 0.4 in whatever direction. So, and you think that that's like too high of a spread, you could deposit new money in there, buy up the one that you think is low relative to the other, and then sell it as the spread squeezes. So like that opportunity of like either assets being volatile or assets just being mispriced, anything where someone thinks they can make money, it's like you have to take on the trade somehow. And so usually that includes, bringing in some, like bridging in liquidity so you can make that trade. So bridging in value in whatever form, could be USDC, anything, to just seize that opportunity. So that's kind of why I think it can, like, leveraging the speculative aspect of PulseX pricing the values of a token on ETH versus Pulse. I think that can bring in a lot of liquidity if that's like really leaned into. Like, so, I mean, for instance, like all of our assets today, we'd rushed to build, before PulseChain. I mean, we cut the Maxi launch was supposed to be 30 days, cut it to 14 because we thought mid-May. So, we've always thought, like, kept that in mind for, like, with the copy in mind. But even for assets after PulseChain launches, so after the snapshot for the copy, you can deploy a contract to both chains at once, and it has the same contract address. It's identical. They're independent from each other, but so, and that's what I intend on doing once PulseChain goes live, is to, any new asset would be launched on both as if it was there for the copy. Just because I think that dual chain aspect is like the most important part. Way more so than like just the low fees that will happen because it'll have relatively low use compared to Ethereum.
Well, let's say that I'm a Link whale or a Mana whale or some other popular coin on Ethereum, and I see PulseChain's launching, and I'm like, whoa, PulseChain's launching, cool. I got a whole bunch of these tokens. I wonder what they're worth on PulseChain. What would be going through my mind as far as just like making money via the liquidity providing or bridging? Like, what would you do if you were just a huge whale in one coin on Ethereum? Maybe it's Hex, maybe it's otherwise, and you're trying to look for those opportunities. Like, how would you actually take advantage of them?
Yeah, I mean, so if you're like a mega whale, and it's like, say your copied version has some value, it may be hard for you to extract much of it at all. And so in that case, maybe those people bridge over and then provide liquidity and try to earn fees, where like they don't necessarily care, which one goes up relative to the other. Like they'll just provide liquidity across all ranges. So like that's probably, some side of it. But also like the very large whales, they have a lot like lower tolerance for risk. And anytime there's a new chain, like there's certainly risk involved. And so I could see like the majority, like the people who are most likely to bridge their assets over to PulseChain are probably going to be more so people below some threshold where like it's almost like you have too much to lose, too much to risk on like a unproven chain, when like it's like you already have your copy that's there waiting for you, and so like any appreciation in that price, it's like you capture, so you don't need to bear any risk of bridging your assets that have markets that have been around for years on a chain that's been around for years, like very low relatively low risk compared to a brand new chain. So I think actually probably a lot of whales probably aren't going to bridge over because it's just kind of too much risk for not enough reward. And just as it kind of proves itself and builds out that liquidity base, then they'll probably start bridging in. But I mean, it is kind of a tough sell to, for that, because like if you have tens of millions of dollars to lose, like, and there's not tens of millions of dollars of liquidity on the copy, and you don't think there's going to be substantial fee revenue from liquidity provision, like there just might not be much of a reason to move that over. Maybe they'll play with their copies kind of because that's like a segmented, like, they didn't have it at the start. So if something goes wrong, it's not like they're losing anything. So that, just over time, it probably will change just as some of that risk is alleviated. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I could see a lot of whales kind of, just kind of waiting to see, because it's almost like there's not so much of a rush. And maybe if they're into taking on some chance, they'll just like, send like a couple $1,000 over on the bridge in something where they're like, okay, like they'll take that risk, but they're not going to risk like bridging all their assets over, until it has sufficiently low risk.
Well, once they bridge their assets over, what would they do with the bridged over assets?
Trade them or liquidity provide, which is just trading in a different way. Yeah. And also, I mean, the whales, they don't really care about the low fees, so like they're not really prohibited from doing anything on Ethereum. And so, whereas like some smaller users, maybe they'll bridge over to like, do something and then bridge back to settle back into Ethereum, but to take advantage of low fees for a certain type of contract, maybe for like trading or maybe like lending. But yeah, I mean, it's like those large players, they don't capture that value proposition of the low fees. So it's just kind of a different use case for them.
What would be like the ideal product? Or I mean, when I think of it, Decentraland, Mana comes to mind because I know I think before they had some problems of just using ETH for different stuff operating on the platform because it was so expensive, at least at the time. And maybe it settled down more now that we're in these market conditions, but it was pretty rough a while back for that. Is that something like there's some like crazy Mana where they got 100 million a Mana or 10 million or something, and they see PulseChain and they don't know if the product's going to work there. They don't know if Decentraland is going to configure the clients to work on PulseChain or not, to use cheaper fees. And maybe that solves some problems, maybe it doesn't. But they get their airdrop copy, they get their maybe they can bridge stuff over. What is the ideal product scenario where bridging over assets or a product on ETH really takes off on PulseChain?
I mean, Hex, like, I mean, if
Hex
like,
is a given, yeah.
But also, like, the fees, the high fees, and like, the problem I always described with the Hex stakes being infeasible to end. It's like, it's actually a pump-mental. So like, maybe Hex isn't even a good example of that, where like, because like in other things, like the high fees makes the value of the asset go down. But in our case, the high fee causes long-term staked Hex to not come liquid. So it prevents people from realizing long-term positions, which is very bullish. So like, I don't even know if Hex is even a good example for something to take advantage of low fees, because like, if everyone can afford to end their stake, now there's much more liquid circulating supply ready to sell. Whereas in Hex on Ethereum, say like half of the max length stakes aren't feasible to end. Like, that's insane supply shock of like, as the market prices in the new reality, which is, the market prior was pricing in, okay, like all this Hex is coming unlocked, plus all this yield is coming unlocked, in the future. But then if like it becomes clear that a bunch of that is not, then, kind of how like in Bitcoin, the halvenings, it's like the market reacts to the new stock to flow ratio, where like the daily issuance cuts in half. And if like high fees, especially because every day that goes on, each stake, like a day one stake costs more and more every day. And so it could kind of have that same type of like halvening effect, where like the current daily inflation relative to like future daily inflation could have changes due to that supply that is not able to be minted back into existence. So, it can be quite bullish there. I'm thinking like maybe things that are like more consumer use cases can be really useful on a new chain, because like, you're giving up some amount of centralization in order for the low fees, and you're bearing some extra risk, because PulseChain will be, even though it's a fork of Ethereum, it's not in an identical fork, but it's generally, so it kind of alleviates, like, it's not like a brand new chain, brand new tech, it's relatively well, tested in real life from where it's starting from, so that, it's less risky than like a brand new type of chain. But like, and that's what we like, a lot of the use cases that I think have kind of latched onto Solana, like like kind of like consumer NFT game type of things, where like, it's like it's not big money use case. It's not like your whole life savings use case. It's not like big finance. It's like consumer gaming, or just like, so I think smaller scale consumer stuff could be popular. And there could be some like breakthrough game that just brings on millions of users, and like you have to be on PulseChain to do it, so I think that's there. Also, I mean, just like shitcoinery, like kind of how BSC was like a hub for shitcoinery, and then AVAX, I mean, all these chains, they kind of attract that, where you're trying to attract users, like you want to attract like 1 million users with $100 each type of deal. Where the low fees kind of matter. And but the big money use case, they, like I said earlier, like they don't need low fees, and in many cases they prefer high fees, because high fee is a signal of permanence. Because if something's expensive to write to, that means it's a profitable business to keep that network operating. And so it's an indicator that the chain is likely to be around for quite some time. And if you're on a long-term time horizon with money you can't afford to lose, that matters. And you're willing to pay that fee because it's a signal that the chain is going to be there. But like low fees, if it's not feasible to operate, then, you know, there's risk that it could just, you know, what if all the validators just didn't, you know, what if, you know, just didn't care because they couldn't make fees. So that's like the, you know, so I think kind of more like a lot of consumer or like kind of, you know, use cases where like, you know, it's not like a life or death mission critical thing. Where you can sacrifice some of that permanence and, you know, and you can tolerate more risk because you can save on fees for like, you know, your game or like your NFT project or something. So that's kind of what I see.